a lot of people here. I hope you know we're going to be talking about container gardening, but usually it doesn't draw quite such a big crowd, which is pretty exciting. So my name's Colin, and I would encourage you, as I talk, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions as I go. I actually prefer to sort of have a more engaged conversational tone rather than me just sort of telling you things, which some of the things you may not need to know or be interested in. So I'm going to talk about container gardening in general, and primarily edible container gardening, because that's what I focus on. The Seattle Urban Farm Company is essentially just a small edible landscaping company here in Seattle. So we design and build edible gardens for people at their homes or for restaurants or whoever wants them. So I'm just going to go through the basics of container gardening, and then maybe do a little demo and answer whatever questions you have, hopefully. So are most people here already active gardeners? Is there yeah? Some people that are just looking to get started, maybe. Okay, and some people in the middle. Well, I'm going to talk about everything from the very basics. So if you have specific questions, like I said, let me know. And I guess I'll just get started. So with any edible garden, the most important thing possible is the amount of sun that the garden gets. Almost any vegetable crop or fruit crop performs best in full sun, and full sun means a minimum of 6 hours during the summer. And I would say in our climate, more sun is always better. There's not really a spot you're going to find that gets too much sun for an edible garden. So there's a little illustration here, and it's sort of just prompting you to think about your property, and assess it where you're going to get the most sun. And ideally, you'll be able to find a spot that gets a lot of sun and isn't being utilized for something else that's more important than a garden. So, a somewhat interesting thing about this image is that the sunniest spot in your property might not be the southern side. The sun exposure is on the south, but if you have a property where there's a lot of space north of your house, the northern edge of your property might be the sunniest place. So it's just, a reminder to look around everywhere and think about really where it gets the most sun. And then this is also kind of important because this is applicable right now. We're going into the winter, and at our latitude, the trajectory of the sun changes dramatically through the year. So in the middle of the summer, it's really, really high in the sky. In the winter, it gets really low. And so what you'll find is in the summertime, something that in the winter, on the north side of your house may be completely in the shade, but during the growing season, it actually gets sun during the day. And you may not realize that if you're checking it during the middle of winter. And similarly, what I've seen, more often than I'd like to think is that, people are assessing things in the middle of winter and they have deciduous trees. And so a spot appears to be sunny, but then as soon as it gets warm, that tree fills out and their new garden site is actually in the shade. So just pretty basic things, but extremely important. So, chances are, I guess if you're having a container garden, you're going to be putting it somewhere that's not just in the middle of your lawn, and you're going to be using another surface. So this is just an image. We build and we see people set up container gardens pretty much anywhere, and people are really creative. They'll fill a driveway that they're not using, or a portion of their driveway, or a paved area or gravel area near a driveway or in front of their house, or on a deck, or on the top of a flat garage, or pretty much anywhere that they can put those containers as long as it's getting sun. And that's sort of the advantage, I guess, of containers over an in-the-ground garden, is that you have more options about where you can put it, because you can essentially build it anywhere. There are disadvantages to container gardening as well compared to in-the-ground gardening, but we'll just focus on the positives here. So, imagine that you have a spot with a lot of sunlight and you feel like it's appropriate for a container garden. One of the most important things is that you're going to have an easy access to a water source, which is something I don't think I could overstress. One of the most common problems that people have with a container garden is that they let them dry out. And it's important just to realize that in the middle of summer, like the last couple months that we had here, it didn't rain for 8 or 9 weeks. And any garden was going to be getting really dry, but a container garden, you know, in weather like that may need to be watered as much as twice a day. Containers are, you know, all the soil is above ground, and so it's all basically exposed to the sun and heat, and so the soil in a container dries out much more quickly than the soil that's like at ground level. So this is something, well, I guess maybe it would just be worth talking about right now, because I think it's extremely important, is just making sure that you're going to be able to water your plants in your garden when they need it. And I highly recommend setting up a drip irrigation system if that's something that you feel like you can do. It's something at the end of the talk, I guess maybe I actually brought a lot of the components to a drip irrigation system. It's something that people sometimes are intimidated by when they've never seen it, because it sounds complicated, but it's not complicated. It's actually very inexpensive and easy to set up, and you can get everything you need at any sort of local box store. If you just pick out all the pieces and take it home, and you can assemble it in an hour. And what that allows you to do is, you'll see in this image, there's a hose spigot, and right beneath it, there's what we call a Y valve, and that allows you to still have a garden hose connected to your water source, so you're not like always disconnecting something and connecting something else. And immediately after that is a battery-operated timer, which is very inexpensive. They cost about $30, and that allows you to automatically water your garden whenever it needs to be watered, so you don't have to be there. And so this is really important. You know, people who are working or have a lot going on, you can set it to go first thing in the morning, you can set it to go in the middle of the afternoon when it's really hot and you're not around. And that, you know, having that flexibility and the ability to do that and just not really have to think about it can be the difference between success and failure, I think, for a lot of people with a container garden. So there's a couple other components on there, but I guess maybe I'll just talk about that later as we get into the demonstration. So this is me hand watering. This is what we're trying to avoid. There are going to be points in the year probably where, in addition to doing your drip irrigation, you know, you're going to be there and you're going to want to just spray some extra water on the garden, which is fine. It's not necessarily like setting up a drip irrigation system doesn't mean you never pick up a hose or anything like that. It just is basically the most regular way to water a garden and prevent that from happening. But, you know, hand watering is still important with a hose or, you know, a watering can. So here is a picture of some drip irrigation line. So as you can see, it's really simple. And the bottom, along the bottom there, that's just like a plastic tubing that comes off the hose spigot, and it connects to these smaller tubes. And the one that's in the pot actually just has little holes drilled in it, and it's called emitter tubing, and that just sort of slowly drips water right at the soil level when you're not around. So this image, I guess, while we're talking about watering, is sort of just talking about drainage. So depending on the type of container that you choose, and here in a minute I'm going to go over a couple different types of containers and I guess their benefits and drawbacks. But with certain types of containers, you really actually do have to be careful about how well that it drains. It's really important because, you know, second to letting the container dry out, if you overwater and the container does not drain properly, the roots will become saturated and drown, and basically your crops will also fail. So this is sort of a standard way of, these are drain rocks basically put in the bottom of a container, and I might as well show you. So this is a very common sort of container you might see, or type of container you might see, like a glazed clay container. You would get at any store or nursery, and almost without fail, they're really poorly set up for drainage. So the tricky thing is when you have a container like this, it's clay, and if you drill into it, there's a really good chance you're going to crack it, but it actually wasn't very well built, but this is what people are usually selling. So if you have a container like this, it's really important that you prop it up on something. You know, they make little feet you can put under there, you can put bricks under it, something to keep it a little bit off the ground so that hole doesn't get clogged. And then you use something like a drain rock or pumice or even gravel. People use broken parts of other pots that they used to have in the bottom. And the idea is you're just creating a space where after the water goes through the soil, it can freely get out of the container and it doesn't get clogged up. Otherwise, that single hole on the bottom there could easily get clogged with soil. So there's other types of containers, you know, that maybe come with adequate drain holes. And you know, this is sort of just like a nursery pot as an example. So this is plastic, and you can see the entire bottom of it is perforated with holes. If you were going to be planting it, say you had a bunch of these and you wanted to plant whatever flowers or crops into it, this probably has enough drainage that you don't need to put something in the bottom of it. So you can just fill this with soil without having to worry about putting extra drainage in there. So it's kind of a container by container situation. If you had a pot like this and it didn't have all these drain holes and you was plastic and you felt like you could just drill a bunch of holes in the bottom, then that would work as well. And that's what people usually do with like larger wooden containers that they have. People plant a lot in wine barrels. And when they do that, it's important just to put, you know, in a wine barrel 10 or 20 holes in the bottom of it so that you can make sure the water is actually going to drain out of it properly. One thing that I think is really important is that you plant crops or whatever you're planting in an appropriate sized container. And this is something that's hard to overstress, and it'd be hard to go through every single crop and tell you what size of container to put it in. It has actually information that's in our book. We try to go through every single crop. There's a section in it that is called crop profiles, and it kind of says you should have about this size container for one of these plants, or this many like gallons or cubic feet of planting space per plant. Because no matter what you do, if you do everything else that we're going to talk about today properly, it's in the sun and it has good soil and it's well fertilized, if the container is too small, the plant will become stressed because it won't have space to grow new roots. And over time, like what we're going to talk about later, like a lot of plants will become root bound, which means the roots sort of circle around the container and strangle itself. But with a quick growing crop, like an annual crop, which is maybe what you're going to be planting in there, that can happen very quickly because their roots grow very quickly during the year, so they can become really stressed if they're in too small of a container. And so, you know, the volume of soil that you have per each crop is actually really, really important. And you're going to probably want to err on the size of being too large rather than too small, because the easier it is for a plant's roots to move through the soil, the healthier it's going to be and the quicker it's going to grow, and the more food it's going to produce for you. So, I guess I'll just go through a few different types of containers, and this is just actually a photo of some raised beds. I guess prompting the question, like, what makes, you know, where's the line between a garden and a container garden? And the answer is I don't know. But typically, like, these beds are about 18 inches deep and they're about 10 feet long and 4 feet wide. And what we found is that, you know, when you have that much space, we usually just consider that like a garden bed, and it seems to perform better or just as well with a planting mix in it, something that you would use in the garden, because there's so much soil volume there. And when we get into smaller containers, what we find is that we always want to use a potting soil mix, which basically the soil is constructed of different elements because of the limited amount of soil that you have. So we build raised beds out of kind of anything. Most often people want cedar. Cedar wood is relatively expensive, but is very rot resistant, naturally rot resistant, so it lasts a long time. So like a bed like these, you know, cedar in an outdoor application should last about 10 years. And there are a few what they call like wood stabilizing stains that are, you know, considered eco-friendly and food safe that are supposed to help extend that life by, you know, as much as double it. So a bed like this could last, you know, at least like 15 years in the garden. So we also sometimes build them when people are really worried about cost out of fir, and that'll still last, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 years before it really needs to be repaired. We don't ever build garden beds out of treated lumber. There are people that do, and there's actually, you know, my understanding is there's some research that's come out recently that says, you know, it's really not going to be that harmful and it moves out of the soil pretty quickly. My personal stance is that there's enough contaminants in the environment already and I don't really want to put them in my garden, so we just don't do it. I guess I wouldn't just abjectly tell people it's the worst idea ever, but I know that even handling treated, like pressure treated lumber is bad for you because it rubs off in your hands. When you handle it, you get that orange stuff all over your hands, and Those are essentially chemicals that are there to make sure the wood does not rot. So, so we usually stick with natural woods. But, you know, getting off the subject of larger garden beds, here is a picture of a wine barrel, something that people use all the time. We set these up. They work really well. If you make sure there's adequate drainage. They're relatively large, so you can actually grow a pretty wide variety of crops in these. You can grow a blueberry in one of these wine barrels. You can grow potatoes, which is what's shown here. Even like a summer squash or a winter squash would do pretty well, or a tomato would do well in that. A lot of those crops are pretty meaty, and so planting them in smaller containers, a lot of times it won't be very productive. I usually think about a squash as a really good example. A zucchini plant is something people plant in containers a lot, but almost invariably plant them in very small containers, at which point they are just stressed out and produce very few, if any, fruits. But if you give them a larger container like this, you can actually have a normal-sized, healthy zucchini plant. So these are really great containers, in my opinion. Okay, so here as a picture, these are cucumbers growing up on a trellis, and they're all just in plastic buckets, which also seem to work just fine. These are just restaurant food buckets that we used, drilled holes in the bottom and planted in them, and they perform pretty well. They're each about 5 gallons. So there's a healthy cucumber plant in each one, and they did really well. So that's something that, aesthetically maybe not the best thing, but in terms of cost, usually the best. Yeah, I think this is considered a 3-gallon container, and it's really weird because plant pots they're rated by gallons, but it's not really accurate. Like if you poured a gallon of milk in a 1-gallon plant container, it wouldn't be the same amount. Like a 1-gallon pot is smaller than a gallon, but it's just sort of how they're rated. It's sort of like a made-up number, and which is actually double ridiculous, because usually potting soil or soil comes in cubic feet, and so it's really hard to say oh, this container holds this many cubic feet, because that's not how they rate it. They rate it by a made-up system that nobody understands. But that is considered a 3-gallon container. Quickly, and I actually think I skipped a slide in here, but I wanted to just one more thing about ceramic pots, because I think that this is something that people use a lot because they like the way that they look, different styles, and this is something that people sell everywhere, is that there are glazed pots and then there are unglazed pots. An unglazed pot would be like the classic terracotta that you see, it's orange. My experience has been, terracotta pots are actually, I like the way that they look, but because they breathe through the clay, they actually dry out even more quickly than any other container I've ever used. So I think there's, a benefit to using, if you're going to be using clay, to be using glazed, or just to be hyper aware that your soil is going to dry out very, very quickly, which is sort of what terracotta pots are infamous for. But again, both types are usually not built properly, so you need to be really aware of the drainage in those. So this slide, which is relatively difficult to see, these containers all along here, it's actually a brand. They're called earth boxes. But the way that they're built is that it's called a sub-irrigating container, and so there are actually no drainage holes in the bottom, but instead there's sort of the bottom of the container and then a shelf that has holes in it, and there's a pipe on the side, and so when you water it, you basically just fill the pipe up and the bottom of the container full of water, and then the water wicks up through the soil to feed the plants from the bottom. And that's something that people are using a lot these days. They're becoming really popular. My experience has been that they perform just fine, but I don't think they perform any better than regular containers. The idea is, that plants are supposed to grow more quickly and be healthier, but through our experience, they do about the same. Some crops do better in these, maybe a little bit. Some crops do a lot worse. So I think it's just something you can try it if you want. People grow a lot, like tomatoes are something that's very popular, and tomatoes do seem to do well in these. But I wouldn't say that they do better than they do in a properly set up container of another type. And so the drawback is that these are pretty expensive for the size of container that you get. So I just wanted to put it out there because I think it's interesting, and it's something that some people swear by and say that they're the best thing that they've ever used. My experience is sort of kind of hit or miss, but it might be interesting to try at some point if you get really into container gardening. And then the last sort of, you know, what I think counts as a container garden, this is a hydroponic garden. So this is another, it's kind of crazy, which most hydroponic systems are. It's called the tower garden. And so this bottom section is all full of water, and there's actually a pump that then pumps water up through the middle, and that water sort of trickles down across the roots. And each plant is sort of put in these little plugs, and all the roots hang in there in the middle, and there's liquid nutrients in the water, and that's what feeds the plants. And this is another sort of like super popular, you know, people are really excited about hydroponics these days. And again, I'm not completely sold on it. I think there's benefits and drawbacks to it. One drawback is that at this point in time, it's impossible really to grow organically if you're doing hydroponics. Because of the nature of organic fertilizers, they tend to grow funguses, and they're not really liquid enough to sort of work in a system like this. There's too many basically organic nutrients, and so in this you really want just like the nutrients to be completely dissolved in the water and to move through and not sort of clog up the system. But organic fertilizers invariably will clog up the filter, and you'll get all sorts of weird things growing in it. So if growing organically is really important to you, then this might not be the system for you. What people claim is that they use a lot less water. And so depending on, you know, if you're talking to a hydroponic salesperson, they'll tell you it uses 10% of the water as you would use in a regular garden. I tend not to believe many of the things hydroponic salesmen tell me, but things did perform pretty well in this and in other hydroponic systems that I've seen. Another sort of idea behind hydroponics is that they are not really exposed to soil-borne diseases, which can be a huge problem in a garden. Actually less of a problem in a container garden, because a lot of times you're turning over the soil or changing the soil out more often in a container garden than if you're growing in the ground. But it's an interesting argument nonetheless. But I just wanted to put it out there because I think if you are spending time researching containers, gardening, and home gardening, that you'll come across hydroponic systems at some point. And then I guess we'll get into, you know, some different aspects of container gardening. If you're planning on growing anything indoors, I thought this was especially relevant since I guess it's fall, and I didn't know if that's what anybody was thinking. Because people ask a lot, you know, can I grow this indoors in the winter? Can I grow that indoors in the winter? And there are, you know, reasonable things you can grow inside. This is a picture of lettuce and soft herbs, you know, like chives and parsley and things like that. You can grow inside. But I would say if you're going to do it, you should really have a light set up. If the light is set up properly, this is a picture of a fluorescent light. You can actually grow with fluorescent lights, which use very little energy. But the issue is they have to be really close to the plant. So you have to have a way to move the light fixture depending on the height of the plant. Another option are, you know, like metal halide bulbs, professional grow lights, but those are pretty expensive, and they also draw lots and lots of energy. At this point in time, you know, my understanding and experience is that they have lots of LED grow lights as well, but they're essentially as effective as a fluorescent bulb and about 20 times as expensive. So I think if you were going to try to do some indoor growing, it would be good to start with pretty simple plants and try to use fluorescent bulbs. This is a general sort of concept there. So this, I guess, is something, you know, besides the hydroponic section, something that's really important, is the type of soil that you're going to be using for a container garden. And like I mentioned earlier, and Cedar Grove is just here because they like to donate things. I'm not a salesperson for any brand. But this is a pretty good potting soil. And it's important to use potting soils because they have ingredients mixed in there that basically keep a soil structure that works well in a container. And the main thing is that the soil doesn't compact. So if you were to scoop soil out of your garden and put it in a container, it would basically just eventually settle down until there really wasn't any airspace in there. And that would, you know, you need some airspace in your soil for plants to live and their roots to grow and to breathe. And so what that does is compacts and it basically suffocates the roots of the plant. And that's why people make potting soil. And so potting soil is a mixture usually of a little bit of compost, some peat moss, which holds a lot of water and is pretty spongy, and then a rock like vermiculite or perlite. And what that does is sort of create airspace in that soil. If anybody doesn't feel like they know what potting soil is like, I would recommend coming up here afterwards and like checking it out and feeling it. It's pretty interesting. It feels really different. It's really soft and very fluffy. And the idea is you want it to stay like that because it's really important for the success of your plants in that container. You can kind of see in this picture, like the white dots there, that's perlite. And that's basically they heat up a rock until it pops into this position where it just keeps air inside of it. And so it keeps that soil structure. And after choosing the right soil, I think one of the things maybe aside from not having enough sun or from letting the garden dry out is that people almost invariably under-fertilize edible crops. So we always fertilize with organics, just because that's what I believe in. And there are lots and lots of options, and there's some Walt's organic fertilizer over here, which is a product that we use a lot. This is a blend of fertilizer that we make. Primarily I brought it just to show you sort of like what it looks like. It's called a granular fertilizer, and it's basically a bunch of different types of powder. And the advantage of a granular fertilizer that has small particles is that it's easy to mix up into the soil and it breaks down more quickly. If you have a really clumpy fertilizer, then those particles are just like slowly dissolving, and occasionally you can have issues with them molding or just the nutrients not being available to the plants in like a short period of time. So the more ground up the fertilizer is, usually the more quickly it starts to break down and release nutrients, which are then available to your plants. So you can see here's a picture, basically filling a container and mixing in fertilizer as I go and stirring it all through the soil. And there are fertilizing recommendations for an individual crop will vary. It's another thing that we have kind of listed in our book where you could just kind of research per individual crop. Some crops need more fertilizer than other crops. A good example would be if you're planting lettuce in a container. If you added a little bit of fertilizer to it, it would grow just fine. You'd be able to harvest it and it would grow perfectly. And you could probably get away with growing lettuce in potting soil without adding any organic fertilizers. But if you planted a tomato or a squash, you would want to mix in fertilizer at the beginning, and you'd probably want to add a supplemental dose of fertilizer once or twice during its growing cycle and make sure that it had enough energy, enough nutrients to keep growing and keep producing food. You could probably keep the plant alive for the entire season without fertilizing it, but it would be stressed and it wouldn't be producing the volume of food that you want out of it, which I guess is the goal, is to really baby these plants along and give them everything that they want so that in the very short period of time they actually have to grow, that they can just sort of crank out as much food as possible. And I guess that's why we're doing edible gardening, really. So, so this is a picture of a pH meter, and this is something also in container gardening is not always relevant. Usually if you're setting up a new garden, like the pH of something like a potting soil is probably pretty balanced where you want it. But if you're growing over a few seasons and you're just adding new soil and new plants to existing containers, the pH in that container is probably going to change. And if you're doing that, I would recommend checking the pH each subsequent season. Most edible crops want to be in a range between 6.3 and 6.9. It's a little bit acidic on like the pH scale from 1 to 14. And especially if a container is left out all year, because it's getting rained on all the time, the rain is slightly acidic. And so just like the ground here, it just like slowly acidifies. And if the pH of your soil gets out of the ideal range, what that basically happens is that even if you're supplying nutrients to the plant might not be able to absorb them. It can only absorb nutrients in a certain range of pH. So it kind of seems like a thing that you shouldn't have to think about, like only scientists should have to think about pH, but it's really important if you want your garden to be successful. And sort of on that same idea, here's a picture of a bay tree, which is a perennial edible that grows really well in a container and can grow in there basically indefinitely, be pruned and stay small. And like the question we had earlier, what ends up happening is if you grow a plant in a container for a really long time and it's healthy, the plant roots are going to grow everywhere and it's become root bound. So the roots are going to circle around because they don't have anywhere to go. And for a plant to stay healthy, it needs to basically have continual root growth through its life. So if you're keeping perennials, is this thing doing something weird? In a container for a long period of time, eventually you're going to have to pull it out and prune the roots. And you know, the time on that depends on, you know, how big the container is, what the specific plant is, and, you know, just how healthy it is. But inevitably, again, it's being slow, you're going to pull the plant out. Here I'm holding a rosemary, and you can see the bottom, that's all roots, which are kind of getting massed up. Inevitably, even if something as large as that bay, we're going to want to tip that container over and pull it out and basically cut the outer roots off and loosen that soil up and add some new soil and give it a chance to set out new roots for a couple years. And this goes for pretty much anything. It even goes a lot of times for houseplants. If they've been around for a really long time, they'll really benefit from being pulled out and having their roots pruned and being put back in the container. So here's me. I've got some hand pruners. You can use a knife. You can use scissors. The idea is to take off really large chunks and to cut all the sections where it's circling around. And then you can see in the next photo, I think I'm sort of putting it back in and really loosening the soil. The best time would probably be the spring. So you'd want to do it like early in the spring when it's still raining, but it's just about to start growing. And that'll be, you know, then basically you'll kind of traumatize it, but you'll be going right into the best growing season. But it'd be a harder thing to do in the middle of summer because it would probably stress it out so much that you could kill it. So this is sort of, you know, the opposite of perennial container gardening. This is what a slide is supposed to indicate that what we talk about is succession planting. So succession planting is when you use a space to grow multiple crops during a single year. And this shows on one side there's arugula, and on the other side there's lettuce, which at my default sort of fast-growing successional planting crops are salad greens. Salad greens grow well here almost year-round, so we grow tons of them. I mean, they're highly, highly productive. They have very low needs, and you know, in like the best growing conditions, as a crop like baby lettuce or arugula, you can seed it and be harvesting it 30 days later. So if you have numerous containers you're growing salad greens in, and you space them out, and you know, you seed a salad green into each container in 1 week at a time, you can be harvesting off of those, and then when one's finished, you can pull it out, re-prepare the soil, and then plant another crop into there. So there's certain crops that we grow in, you know, small gardens that grow really fast because we feel like we can just get the most food out of that space as long as it's something that somebody wants to eat. And salad greens would be sort of like the king of that section of plants. But what's important if you're doing succession planting is that you are trying to take care of the soil in between each planting. So typically a fast-growing crop like this, you would be able to pull out the roots and maybe loosen up the soil, add a little bit more fertilizer, add a little new topsoil, like potting soil to it, and then plant again into it. But over time, you know, over the course of a season, you might exhaust the soil, and so the next year you want to switch out half of it or something. Eventually you can deplete all the nutrients in a soil in a container and want to just completely start over with brand new soil. And again, that depends on like how intensive you've been growing in it and what crops you've been growing in it, and how big that container is. So what is an organic fertilizer? And it can be a wide variety of things, and typically an ingredient of an organic fertilizer derives from a natural source, which means a plant or an animal source. And so this has bone meal in it, which is basically powdered bones from cattle. Blood meal is a really common nutrient for organic gardening, which is also like basically powdered blood. So a lot of it is you know, waste products from livestock. because they're really nutrient rich and they're in abundance and they're not being used for anything else. This also has kelp meal in it. Kelp is a really nutrient dense plant, and so people collect it and dry it out basically and derive the nutrients out of it. People use fish meal a lot, which is dried out fish carcasses and bones. And then cottonseed meal is another ingredient in a lot of organic fertilizers, which is just cottonseed, which they've been pulverized and it's nutrient rich. And so basically it's either derived from usually a waste product from a plant or a waste product from an animal. The way I usually think about it is that we have all these things that we call vegetable crops, and most of them are derived from some other climate, and we're trying to force them to grow from a seed to harvest in our really relatively short warm period of summer. And so you're kind of asking them to do a lot of work in a short period of time, and you're also wanting them to produce as much food as possible, which takes a lot of nutrients. And so we always call them heavy feeders, or we say they're really needy. And so the more nutrients we can put in the soil, with relatively little cost and effort, the better, and the more productive it's going to be. And the more healthy the plant is, it's also going to fight off pests and fight off diseases. So you're just going to have a lot easier time gardening if you have adequate nutrients in your soil. And so what we've seen in gardens that don't receive any supplemental fertilizer and just have compost don't perform as well as ones that have added organic fertilizers. Okay. It seems to make a really big difference in terms of the diseases that they have and the volume of food that they produce, which is why we advocate it. Because it just seems like if you're putting all this effort into setting up a garden, it's a pretty small additional step to sort of bring you a lot closer to success.